Welcome everybody to Big Tent Live Events, the live online event series from the University of Oxford as part of the Humanities Cultural Programme, itself one of the founding stones for the future Stephen A. Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities. My name is Philip Bullock and I'm Director of Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. Big Tent Live Events brings together researchers and students from across different disciplines to explore important subjects and ask timely questions. We're bringing you this programme online whilst we're all apart, and we hope that you're all safe and well during these difficult days. We do look forward to being able to greet you in person just as soon as we can. If you'd like to ask any questions during our event tonight, then please do pop them in the comments box on YouTube. We encourage you to do this as early as possible so that our speakers have time to answer as many as they can during the Q&A towards the end of the session. So now it's my great honour to introduce our two wonderful speakers. I am delighted to welcome Professor Ngaire Woods and Professor Peter Frankopan. And together they're going to discuss the world after COVID as part of our theme this week, Humanities and Policy. Ngaire Woods is the founding Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and Professor of Global Economic Governance at Oxford University. Her research focuses on how to enhance the governance of organisations, the challenges of globalisation, global government, and the role of international institutions and global economic governance. Peter Frankopan is Professor of Global History, Stavros Niarchos Foundation Director of the Oxford Centre for Byzantine Research, and Senior Research Fellow at Worcester College. He works on the history of the Mediterranean, Russia, the Middle East, Persia, Central and Southern Asia, and on relations between Christianity and Islam. I'm looking forward enormously to what they will have to say this evening. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over the proceedings to them. Peter and Ngaire, thank you and welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you everybody for tuning in. And above all, thank you to Ngaire. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk. I'm sorry we're doing this over the ether rather than in person. But I guess the question to ask the Dean of the School of Government in Oxford is about government responses to pandemic, about why some countries seem to have done better or worse than each other, to help us understand whether in fact they're going to respond differently or better or worse when we start to rebuild once this wave all passes. So I don't know whether you have any ideas about some of those big trends of how to score what's been happening and why.
Yeah, well, certainly at this school, my colleagues Tom Hale and Anna Petherick have been running the Oxford Government Response Tracker. So they've been tracking the response of every government around the world using hundreds of our alumni to submit material. I think there's three surprises for me about which countries have done best. You know, the first is I was part of an international working group a couple of years ago looking at pandemic preparedness. And one of the segues to that was an index of pandemic preparedness where Britain and the United States scored themselves right at the top of the ranking. And so the first surprise is those are not the countries that have done best. It's not been the countries that thought that they were the most prepared. I think a second surprise for me is that the last couple of years have seen a debate about scientists. We need scientists, more scientists in government. And yet that's been far too crude a debate. It's not the governments that are stacked with scientists that have done best. It's the government stacked with the right experts. So it's not modelers and epidemiologists necessarily on their own that you need advising governments. It's a country like Greece, which has done outstandingly well, is a real sign of, wow, that's the kind of country that's done well. Why? It had a really bad financial crisis in 2009. It's cut its health spending by 40%, its hospital budgets by the same. It knew it had no capacity. It knew it couldn't afford to try and build hospitals at the bottom of the cliff. It had to build fences at the top of the cliff. It was led by a pathologist and expert on infectious diseases, not a bunch of fiendish modelers trying to work out what may or may not happen, but somebody who knew how to implement the basics of public health. And it's a government that's pulled together, partly because they've been humble about how big the challenge was. They started long before others. They pulled together. When you ask one of the Greek government, oh, but what are you doing on such and such? They don't say, as too many in this and in the American government say, oh, that's not my job. That's those people over there's job. They say we, and it's the government pulling as a whole together and creating really good partnerships with others. So for me, the surprises have been, it's not the countries that are big and wealthy and and well appointed necessarily. A couple of those have done well. It's not just about science, it's about which kind of expertise. It's having had a crisis helps. Greece had a crisis, Korea had a crisis, the southernmost state of Brazil was in a financial crisis, and these places have all done much better. So lots to learn from this crisis for us as a School of Government about a humble kind of leadership which says, gee, we can't deal with this on our own. We've got to act fast, act preventatively, and act in partnership with many others if we're going to, knock this one back. And those governments have been the most effective, and they've been the most quick to return their populations to a semblance of normal life.
But what you're saying, I mean, the overlaying interpretation on top of data always has its own problems, because correlation and causation are two different things. But I mean, are you also saying then that complex, wealthy, hubristic societies who think that they know what they're doing have come unstuck because they thought they could confront and deal with things that in fact it's turned out that they've not been very good at, whereas smaller, more apparently fragile states with less resources have had to put their backs to the wall quicker, and therefore have managed to make tough decisions more easily? I mean, is there something in that, do you think?
I think there's something in that. I don't think it's obviously it's not quite that simple. And, Germany's done pretty well, and it's got lots of the attributes of your first category. What Germany did very well right at the beginning, China released the genome sequence to the world on the 11th and 12th of January. And by the 16th of January, the German government had already engaged its universities, and they had already come up with an effective test for the virus. And that's all about governments that have got effective partnerships with their universities, with their business sectors, and with their local governments, and they can kind of orchestrate their system of government. But, in your parts of the world, Peter, tell us what it looks like. So, Russia and Eurasia, what's surprised you in the response to the crisis?
I think it's been a game, I was going to say a game of two halves. It's probably been a game of three halves. I know that doesn't add up. But, in the first couple of months of this year, all of this discussion point around this space was about the pressures on China's leadership around the desire for democratization, about the failure of the Communist Party to deal with Wuhan openly, properly, and reasonably, and the decisions that cost time and cost lives, not just in China, but in fact sent this globally all around the world. That has given way to a very different narrative, which has been that in fact within China it's it's mantra, but also to onlookers. We forget that the world isn't just about the US, China, and in our case the UK. And there are other parts of the world who are looking that say, well, on balance, China did quite well in dealing with it. And in fact, looking at these democratic states that are very wealthy, they have close connections with the private sector. They've got all these brilliant academics all around the world. And in fact, they seem to have dropped the ball too. And as you know better than anybody, those kind of discussions about the problems of democracy have been ongoing for quite some time now. And one of the real concerns in the US and in Europe is the lack of faith in democratic systems by young people. In every single country in Europe right now, confidence in what democracy means. And it's, these things are slightly up in the clouds. It depends who asks the question, where, why, and how. But, it looks like people who should do better at resolving these problems haven't done so well. And that has, I think, played into China's hands with its domestic narrative. But, other states that have done conspicuously well across the region, South Korea in particular, but Southeast Asia too, I think that they learned lessons from the SARS outbreak in 2002, 2003, where the idea there is that when there are problems, they don't just get solved by doctors in white gowns in hospitals and research scientists. They get solved by AI. They get solved by digital. They get solved by tools that can supplement and identify and isolate and track things down. And in that sense, I think there is a sort of wider feeling across, and Asia is a very misleading and difficult term. There's really nothing in that you can compare, Turkey down one end with North Korea down the other. But I think there is a sort of, there is an awareness that the West hasn't really come to the party very well. And we've complicated that, I think, by
Peter, is that?
In the case of the States, for example, of talking about how vaccines should be available first to the United States and again, China's doing it differently. So things look different in the last couple of months, where there's a sort of buoyancy. I mean, we'll see what happens with this latest wave in Beijing, but there's a kind of buoyancy about, well, maybe there are wider narratives around who's going to be most effective. And those are very dangerous for us in Europe, where we understand what the value of freedoms are. We teach students about that for a very good reason. We understand what equalities, we've got a real issue with that. But again, layering on top of all of this, things like Black Lives Matters, the Bolton revelations last night in his book that many people listening will have seen today in the press, those suggest that there are lots that we're doing more wrong than right. And we need to change that narrative quite quickly to remind what it is that we do well, because headline, we look very incompetent looked at from anywhere outside Europe right now.
Yeah, I guess I don't think, well, I think you're saying that there's a narrative in China and across some of Eurasia that democracies are doing badly, and that narrative is obviously wrong. That there are some democracies that are doing extremely well. So I've mentioned Greece, the Czech Republic, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. These are all democracies that have done extremely well. Germany. And I don't think we can let the poor leadership in other democracies shrug this off and say it's a problem of democracy. It most certainly isn't. It is a problem of leadership. And I think that's a really important point to make. And I guess in the parts of the world that you're so expert on, Peter, we can see the reverse too, right? So Russia is not a democracy, and yet it hasn't done brilliantly, has it? I mean, it's got a country with fantastic science, with clear hierarchical leadership, with quite a lot of social control, and it's done badly. So why?
Well, the impact that this is going to have in Russia is going to be profound. I mean, there are already warning signs in the press, which is, not necessarily the safest place to air these kind of opinions, that the middle classes in Russia are going to get wiped out. And already that was under pressure because of natural resources prices, because of heavy spending on the military. But COVID presents a massive problem. And there's a real disparity in the data in terms of infection levels in Moscow that look like it's coming down and then spiraling in other parts of the country. And one of the stories, I think, about pandemic has been the aggravation of inequalities, regional, gender, racial, et cetera, around in every country, because that's what disease does. It hurts people who don't have access to primary healthcare. It hurts people who can't get medicated. It hurts people who live far from city centers and hospitals. So I think that in the case of Russia, why it's done badly is that the state hasn't known how to handle this and has taken the line that, well, democracies don't really work, so we're not going to do worse than the US or the UK. And it turns out you can do a lot worse than the UK and the US. So I think it's about, in the world, in your school, one of the key things is to disaggregate playing the individual and over-focusing on one leader who sits at the top, however graphic, however visible they might be, and to constantly drill down into the data to show what actually is happening. In my world, in history, it's the other way around. What matters is telling the story. That's what the whole point of narrative history is to focus typically on men, typically on leaders, typically on military battles, and to ignore, like Hegel says, the pages of peace are the pages that are blank in history books. So we overweight things in the wrong direction. I think here the difficulty with pandemic is to stay calm enough to be constantly looking at what is actually the reality on the ground. And that those questions will become more and more important, hopefully, as the disease rushes through the system, because the challenges coming towards us that are not medical related are enormous in terms of the economic challenges we have, and about, again, something which I'm very interested to hear your view on, how resilient we are in global cooperation, because I think you take the view that we're doing quite well in managing to work and travel together in the same direction, and that we should be pushing back against the idea that this is a me first world where all countries only act in their own national interest.
Yeah, I guess I'm perhaps not quite that Pollyanna-ish on global cooperation, but in a world where I think people are saying, look, global cooperation has completely broken down. We now live in a world where China and the United States are at loggerheads. Trade between the two has broken down. They're decoupling on technology. They've quickly moved into a Cold War, and it could even become a hot war in the East China Sea. So there's that narrative that says, therefore, there's no global cooperation under that, because everybody else is going to have to choose between the United States and China. And I think it is quite important. International cooperation is never as perfect as people would like it. It's always the easy thing to flog. But there has been cooperation that has worked. Even as the United States has said the World Health Organization is China's pawn and has withdrawn their funding from it, the rest of us need to look at the fact that that extremely underfunded and overstretched organization, its entire funding is less than the funding that it takes to run one large American hospital. And that's the World Health Organization that's supposed to be our front line on these pandemics. It nevertheless does work with all countries. It can't send an army in if they refuse to share information with it, but China did share the virus sequence with it. It did share that with the rest of the world. It is convening every day conversations among scientists, which are enabling a much more rapid sharing of scientific advances in understanding the virus. And that even in the more, even in other areas of cooperation, people are saying, well, China and the United States are never going to cooperate as they did in 2009 to kind of restart global growth. But actually, underneath all the loud shouting by President Trump and the equally loud shouting domestically by President Xi Jinping, look at what the Federal Reserve is doing in quietly expanding credit lines, improving the conditions of those credit lines to ensure that at least 14 emerging economies weather this crisis without catalyzing a financial crisis. There's a quiet level of cooperation. And it's probably better, frankly, that it stays under the radar, because if it pops its head over the radar, the politicians will surely shoot it down. But that cooperation, which is quite fragile, we are going to have to nurture. Those are the tiny embers of a campfire that we're going to have to blow into life if countries are going to grow out of this crisis instead of crashing out of this crisis.
I mean, one of the things that the school does so well at the Blavatnik is to bring together rising stars from all over the world. And, again, the focus on the US, China, and, maybe other big actors, maybe like Russia and so on. But, it's such a diverse group that you come through the doors to give them fora to try to work together and learn from each other. How do you see global cooperation going forward for states that maybe aren't represented on the front pages or even the middle pages of policy documents, the press, et cetera, where the role of what's going to happen in Sub-Saharan Africa, in North Africa, in the Middle East, Central Asia, and so on, there isn't a kind of forum where these states can necessarily work and collaborate together. So they get lent on very heavily by bigger beasts. Tell us a little bit about how you help provide that kind of resilience at government level, what you teach at the school.
Well, I think the worst world for all countries other than China and the United States, the worst world is a world in which they have to choose exclusively to be in one or other camp, and that there is a risk that the world will move towards that. And in that world, what becomes even more important is the relations among those other countries. And so I guess one of the most important things I think we're doing at the school and at Oxford more broadly is bringing people together from different countries, 80 different countries in the school, so that the Brazilian can actually know their interlocutor, not just in China, but in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Germany, in Britain, in Canada, in Australia, that those personal relationships both bring those other countries alive and also give them somebody they can simply pick up the phone to. And that's not just about cooperation, that's also about learning quickly from other countries. I mean, what we've seen in COVID is countries herding. They're sort of copying each other like lemmings, but not necessarily in a learning way. And not necessarily saying, gosh, what do we learn? What should Britain have learned from Vietnam, right? Britain should have learned from Vietnam that you test. And even if you've got great AI and digital means, you still need your contact tracers to go and knock on people's doors. Why? Because only then do people take it seriously. And so it's learning to learn in an open-spirited way. There's one thing I always say, everyone that walks through the door of the Blavatnik School has one little conviction, which is that their country's different. Other countries should all learn from each other, but their country is unique and special. And I think one of our ambitions is to sort of break that down and help people learn much faster from other countries so that they're not always reinventing the wheel. But I slightly want to come back round to you, Peter, and say, you gave us this account of Russia and this pretty bleak, next few years for Russia. what is that going to do to Russia in global cooperation? Russia's just kind of elbowed its way back into international security dialogue through its actions in Syria and elsewhere. Are we going to see a quieter Russia that is more willing to play both with China and the United States and Europe, or are we going to see a more isolationist, nationalist Russia?
Well, I'm sure there are lots of people listening who will take a different view, but I think over the last couple of hundred years, one could make the case that Russia is quite good at playing a weak hand strongly. I think over the last 10 years, it's gone into reverse, where the real challenge now for Putin is, because he's played the cards he has in Crimea, Ukraine, in the Middle East, and so on, he's not really got that many places to turn. And Russia and the Russian establishment is acutely aware that it's now over-dependent on China as a trade partner. It's over-dependent as a military market. The doors to G7 and towards the West are closed. You have people like Lavrov, a very urbane, articulate foreign minister, who says, we can't trust Europe because it changes its mind every few minutes, which, if nothing else, reveals the frustration, I think, about how do you rebuild bridges, and is there a possible way in which you can do that given the current context? And I think that some of those bridges have been so badly burnt, it's quite hard to see what happens next. So on top of all of that, you have oil supply, which last month at the end of April was negative, and there are budgetary problems and challenges too. So I think there's a real question mark, I think, about how Russia can hang on to and in a changing world where China is going to either become more volatile or more powerful, I guess one or the other. And Russia's real aim, I guess, is to try to get, like the French, like Hubert Védrine, the former French foreign minister, said, is a multipolar world. So it's in Russia's interest to have balances to China as much as it is to the US, EU, and so on. So some of it is how to play those cards, and it doesn't look like a particularly easy hand to play. So some of it, I guess, is about how to manage to trade off positions in one part of the world with another. And like I said, Russia has always been much weaker than we think that it is in terms of its political hierarchies, as well as in what steps it can and should take right now. And I think we have a real problem in the UK, in Europe, in the West, to work out what is it that we're willing to do, how far are we willing to go. And you can see there's a lot of disagreement about all of that. The pipeline's being built through the Baltic right now, where the US have sanctioned any corporation state that intervenes in it, but Russia supplies 40% of gas to Germany, and so these links are very, very deep, and it's quite hard to see how one can suddenly thaw those out.
Yeah, I think there's a transition that might be helpful to integrating Russia and China and the United States and Europe into one cooperative stance, which is, I think a decade ago, and Europe has led on this idea of values-based cooperation, because the alternative was, there was no question that cooperation was going to take place because globalization was at its height. So it was, did you have your values or did you not? Now we're in a different world, where the world choices are either no cooperation or cooperation on the basis of quite stark mutual interests, where values play a lesser role. And in a way, there's an opening there, there's an opportunity to say, okay, let's not be trying to press values down each other's throats first and foremost, where all countries are in a crisis. And the people that are bearing the brunt of that are the poorest and most vulnerable. So our first objective has to be the minimum international cooperation to protect the most poor and vulnerable. And to me, that's going to be the economic cooperation, which enables countries that are very heavily indebted at the moment and becoming very heavily indebted, which includes Britain, Russia, etc., most of the developing world. It's going to be measures that protect those countries not to repeat a really harsh and stringent set of austerity measures, because those on top of COVID are just going to crush and contract their economies in a brutal way that will have reverberations for the rest of the world. So for me, I guess there's a question about whether there's an opening for a very pragmatic, not values-led cooperation, which just says, okay, we need a growth pact, not unlike the 2009, April 2009 G20 growth pact. We need that now. We're all going to cooperate in ensuring there is enough credit in the system to permit countries to do that. And then that's going to be a rising tide that carries all national boats.
Well, you know,
Too optimistic?
yeah, no, I mean, I think no one would engineer themselves to be in a crisis of the scale that we're on now. But I suppose if there are positives to take away from it, is that there's nothing like having to deal with problems that forces you into more realistic perspectives, including of what you've got wrong in the past. So I mean, it's a bit like when people who were talking about reforming Russia in the first decade of the 21st century, so 15 years ago. And I can't remember who it was. It was either Sechin or Lavrov who'd said, you know, when it's, excuse my language, those listening, when it's pissing gold, why would you ever bother put up an umbrella? And that's when oil prices were going, globalization was hyper and so on. And I think when you have to take a reset, which we're having to do for all sorts of reasons, you can be much more honest about the failures of government preparation for pandemic, about inefficiencies within the civil service, about how do you listen to the wrong kinds of, how do you draw the wrong kinds of conclusions. And I think there is all over the world, and there's discussions taking place in the US very acutely around why has the US got China so wrong for the last 30, 40 years? Why has there been this mantra that if you keep on encouraging China to change, it will, and it'll change in the direction that you want it to. And equally, I think there's discussions you find in Beijing, you know, Fu Ying, a very prominent figure in Beijing, wrote in Chinese Newsweek yesterday, saying, you know, if we all deglobalize, this is going to come at a cost for everybody around the world, not starting with China. So I think there is a kind of reset button right now where we've made a lot of assumptions about how the world works, about how we travel, about how we communicate, about growth, all these kinds of things, you know, like Duflo and Banerjee have been talking about for a while. And this may be the moment where we have very fundamental questions about how do we do business domestically with other states that allow us to perhaps reknit how we do things. And I think you know, we've spoken about this before, you know, that there are, one can become extremely depressed and hit the alcohol, but there are ways in which this can be a moment of real rejuvenation, of trying to work out what you're willing to do. But the first thing is to sit with a pen and paper and work out what your boundaries are. What are you willing to do? And are you actually able to follow through with it? And, you know, we see those questions all the time with things like supply chains being reshored, and, you know, Apple and General Motors sell more cars in China than they do in the US. So it's not so simple to say, well, we will take a moral position or political position on one part of the world, but sacrifice shareholder value. And we've got to work out what comes first, shareholders or citizens. And probably it's fair to say, it's a very generalized statement, but shareholders have won, or customers have won, consumers have won at the price of citizens and at the price of jobs. And some of what we're seeing outside the pandemic was suggesting all of that has gone too far anyway. So a reset may not be in the worst, you know, not just Russia, China, but in different states in the world.
But I think that's going to, I agree, and I think that's going to take more confident, more effective government. It's so interesting to see the debate both in Britain and in the United States, where CEOs and business is saying, look, you're underwriting us now. You've earned the right to set new conditions on us. And government's a little bit timorous about doing that. It's really interesting to see governments now playing such a huge role underwriting the economy, but almost paralyzed in their fear of how to take some bold measures to grow after it. And you know, we sit in Britain, I know historians hate us kind of instrumentalizing historical examples, but if you think about the Attlee government in 45 sitting with a debt which was 250%, you know, of GDP, like just huge debt load, and yet realizing that what the times called for, because it wasn't a you know, let's borrow to buy lunch tomorrow. We're in an existential crisis. We've had a war, and now we either have to grow out of this or we'll be in misery for decades. And so they launched this huge, audacious plan, audacious not because it's an announceable at a prime minister's television conference, but audacious in the kind of planning and delivery that they went into to kind of roll out housing for the masses, education for the masses, healthcare for the masses, you know, right at a time when many of today's governments would say, oh, no, we can't go into debt to do that. We're far too indebted. We have to tighten our belts. We as government shouldn't do anything. We should outsource everything. We don't have capabilities to implement. I think we're going to have to relearn all that, and that some of the governments doing best are the governments that actually have the best capability within the government, within the public sector itself. And we're going to need really talented people in the public sector.
And that's a challenge in itself, right? Of encouraging talent and so on. And in the countries that I'm interested in and work on, if you want to get ahead, you work for the state directly or very closely. Russia, Turkey, the Middle East, China. There's no other way. Vietnam. That's just how it works. And it's almost the opposite here. You work often in multinational organizations where your job is to pay as little tax as possible. So 100 of the Fortune 500 companies pay zero corporation tax, and that distorts the playing field when all the brains go into finding ways to create efficiencies that can reward investors, shareholders, employees, but not necessarily be joined up. But on that, I'm very interested, and I have a very open mind about it. Is it harder for democracies where you have electoral systems coming around again and again, and compromise is part of your deal? Is it harder to set course, to take these brave decisions than, let's say, a benign dictator in a mythical city-state where human rights are all respected and everybody's friendly? I mean, does the decision of making good long-term plans, is that harder in democratic states?
It's a great question because it can cut both ways. It's true that if you know you've got 10 years in power, you can take a more long-term view. But it's also true that if you're really good at being a democracy and you've got to stand for election every 4 years, that the kind of policy that you're going to make is going to be really rooted in what the people you're representing need. And that does not mean government run by focus groups and government run by PR agencies, which is the worst kind of excess that democracy has kind of complacently slid into. It means really utilizing every muscle of democracy to use its participatory process to make much better policy. And that's what we're seeing some of the good democracies in the world do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's all, that must all be right. I think that despite the kind of, and the flip side is that in democracies, because we open our wounds in public so often, it all looks like we're doing a terrible job because we reveal transparencies and problems and so on. So one of the issues right now, 40% of newsroom jobs in the US have been lost this year. And yet we see the big social media platforms becoming more and more powerful and resistant to regulation. And, depending on where you sit on the government spectrum, it's not their job isn't to regulate themselves. It's for governments to do that in an effective way. And you can't blame the social media businesses if they don't get the right kind of controls put on top of them or the right kind of direction.
And look, I think that's a great last point, I suspect, before we move to questions from the audience. But the fact that governments and democracies have had to think about the challenge of communication right for the last 500 years. During the time of pamphleteering, when the printing press was invented, people would print scurrilous things on pamphlets that caused riots. And so they had to regulate that if you were going to print a pamphlet, you had to take the address of the person whose pamphlet you were printing. Similarly with radio, similarly with television. We forget that radio has been the cause of genocides and riots in countries. Think about the use of radio in Rwanda, which generated and amplified the genocide. And similarly with television, we forget that when television was invented, the United States had the foresight and wisdom to bring in fair comment rules, which were dismantled during the 1980s, I think, with terrible consequences for an informed public debate. So now this isn't the first time we've had to deal with these issues, and the issue of how you regulate social media to actually ensure that you have an informed democracy is one that all countries have been too slow to grapple with and to regulate. And
yeah, I think we'll do some questions. I mean, as a historian, you go back to 10,000 years, and you can see priests or shaman who say that they can commune with the divine to get themselves into positions of authority and power. So I mean, it's as old as not just the written word, it's as old as human behavior. It's that tendency to want to create hierarchy and to be able to say that you can control the narrative, even when possibly some of these shamans and holy priests in different religions, maybe they were able to, it's not for me to say. But the claim that you can, I think, it does make the point that the fake news spectrum is not a new one. But I don't know whether Philip is going to come back in and take charge of some questions before we wrap up.
Indeed, I am, and through the miracle of technology, here I am. As happens with these occasions, you are answering the questions that have been coming in the live chat organically. And I think you've covered a large number of the questions. A couple of people have asked about the relationship between the epidemic and current policy, and how we might think about environmentalism and a sort of green revolution, and whether this is going to be a consequence and how we do that. And perhaps a related question, or maybe I'm forcing a relation here, is what about social inequality and wealth inequality in societies? Is there a correlation between societies that are highly divided and highly variegated, and those who are perhaps sort of where equality is perhaps more obvious? And those are just two questions that I'm trying to synthesize that have come from the audience, if you want to riff on those.
Ngaire.
Thank you. On the Green Revolution and on social inequality, I mean, what they have in common is that people who have been working on these issues for a long time and you know, with urgency, see the crisis as a possible moment to reset. And there are moments, certainly during this crisis, where I feel that there's a very long queue of people outside my door with the plan that they've been working on for a better world over the last decade, and this is the moment to reset. And I say that as somebody that, of course, wants to see a cleaner, fairer world coming out of COVID. But I think it's not obvious that we'll get a cleaner, fairer world everywhere, and it's going to take everybody playing their part to actually get there. That might sound a bit trite, but it really will. It's going to take partnerships with governments. It's going to take a lot of both citizen and business and NGO action to ensure that governments that are pressed for time, pressed for money, pressed for bandwidth, actually think about how they can do cleaner and fairer. What I would invite all the academics on this call to be doing is, you know, don't sit around waiting to criticize, get in there and think about what is it that's possible within those constraints now, you know, in the next 6 months, when Britain's going to, you know, face huge unemployment, huge constraints. Where is it that your research, your work, your thinking could help fashion ways within those constraints to make it, to rebuild in a cleaner, fairer way?
Yeah, I can't, you know, there's nothing I can say better than that. But, you know, clearly the impact of the last few months has had, you know, enormous implications for us all. A lot will depend on what sticks and what doesn't. But, you know, the working from home, the meetings that you can do virtually and so on, there's a lot of predictivity around what's going to happen to offices and so on. But clearly there are people who have struggled through this process. If you've been living alone, if you have a abusive relationship, if you have small children, if you can't afford to feed them, you know, it's been catastrophic, the inequalities and the problems that have mounted up. But, you know, for the workplace, a lot will depend on whether we start to work more productively but less and consume less. So I mean, you know, all the studies that, again, Ngaire will know better than me, that have been produced in the last few years say that if you work for 4 days a week, if you work for 8 hours a day, that you produce more. In fact, the most compelling study is 4 days a week, you're 40% more productive than if you work 5 days a week. And, you know, when you magnify that through different workforces, when you different locations, different people, the energy consumption alone starts to drop very dramatically. So, I mean, so far we're predicting this year that there's going to be 8% decline in greenhouse gases, which is about the annual output of what India produces. So, you know, a lot will depend. In fact, one of the things I've been looking at when Ngaire said, see how your own work goes, is correlating the fact that because there isn't a rush hour at the moment anymore, well, I mean, we're getting back to it, but people are waking up at different times of the day. And there's some fantastic data from Singapore, from Germany, that the time at which people put their kettles on is spread out over a much longer period of time, which means that you can prepare your energy uses in a different way. You have a much higher capacity to use renewables, you can spread the costs, and you can impact less on demand. And so you can incentivize your population to start not at 9, but at 9:15. You can incentivize businesses to stagger their days. And in fact, you can, through these magnified small interventions, you can produce very substantial outcomes. So, you know, I think there are all sorts of ways in which this is quite a good moment to be thinking, like Ngaire says, very blue sky, and to really work out what is it that you think could change and how do you measure it?
There's just one other thing I want to add, Philip, to the social inequality bit. I mean, the obvious thing to say is that this crisis has shone a very harsh spotlight on the inequalities. So, you know, the UN did a report on children in Britain a couple of years ago that exposed how terribly deprived the lives of so many children in this country are. And the last couple of days of debate about malnourishment and children and meals has highlighted that. One report in the United States refers to 15 million Americans live in accommodation to which the water has been cut off. This is before COVID. You know, that means living in an apartment in which you cannot flush the toilet, right? And you've got families living in accommodation like that. And again, their conditions have been spotlit. But what's also been spotlit in this crisis is that when governments put their minds to it, in partnership with business, they can do something about that. Britain has put almost all of its homeless people into hotels. So has France. You know, we've seen in the matter of 2 days with a footballer, you know, a free school meals plan expanded, although, you know, there is underneath that the need for much, much more action through local government budgets to ensure that the most deprived kids in Britain are supported through this crisis. India has discovered that it can, if it sets its mind to it, you know, provide food for a very large number of people. So what's going to be interesting is what happens when all those taps get shut off. You know, do we simply close the hotels and put everybody homeless back on the streets? Do we just stop the feeding programs that have come with COVID across all countries in the world and accept that children die of hunger every day? You know, there is in that sense an urgency to this moment, which I didn't want to overlook in my comments.
And actually, in the last part of this discussion, we've been hearing words about populations and people, and I'm really struck by the shift in the conversation from the governors and the institutions towards the populations and the people. This reminds me of one of the questions which came in, which was about mentalities or psyche. Have you noticed any patterns about how different cultural traditions, different national styles, different ways of being have related to the governmental decisions and the large-scale institutional decisions? It's always hard to speculate about national mentalities. As a modern linguist, I spend my whole time resisting some of those categories. But have you had time to reflect, or has there been work done on the compact between the governed and the governors and how this has played out in the handling of the crisis?
You first,
from my perspective, you know, what pandemic has done acutely, as all of us, is it's shut down different kinds of information supplies. I mean, so you can still read things and people still talk, but you don't get a chance to listen in the same kind of way. You know, you don't have the ability to follow. So, you know, you can read what people say in the press and you can talk to people on these kind of platforms, but I think it's hard to get a real sense of what really is going on. But I think that the basis of governed rather than the governed, you know, this is such a sharply changing world, you know, and COVID in a way has just brought into sharper relief all these big trends that were coming already, you know, about homelessness, about inequality, about race, and about Black Lives Matters and so on. And it's provided a trigger to start to engage with some of those, and in some cases in a very effective and profound way. So I think it's hard to speak to how that is going to change, you know, how that is currently changing in real time. But, you know, as a scale of what century we're living in, by the end of this decade, by the end of the century, there are going to be 600 million more people in 6 African countries than there are in China, right? So that the population distribution, the demographics, the food requirements, the infrastructure needs, all the opportunities that people are going to need to have mobile phone receptions, bank accounts, food, etc., but also all the challenges to get right, you know, democracies, freedoms, respect, and so on. That the world around us is changing very quickly. And as a boring historian, it always has been. It's just, I think that the pandemic has focused in all of our minds that we're in a kind of pause where, as it happens in the kind of global chain of development, it's not a bad moment to be starting to think how to engage with peoples, with ideas, with challenges that perhaps we should have. I mean, you know, Ngaire and her team said the Blavatsky is an unusual exception, but has more of an opportunity than normal to be really thinking through.
Yeah, I think narratives can be used to blind us to learning proper lessons from other countries. So the number of people that say to me, well, Vietnam's done so well because it's a really powerful government with a huge public sector, and North Asian people are just, you know, obedient, they'll say, in this crass way. And I say, well, none of those apply to Greece. So why has Greece done so well? And then they'll have a different narrative. And I think it can sort of blind us from seeing. But that said, we know that human beings need stories to make sense of what others are doing around them. And there was a moment in Britain at the beginning of this crisis where the idea that we were all staying home to protect each other, to protect our neighbors, to protect the elderly, it was really astonishing how quickly that was accepted by most people. Without coercion, without law, it was the simple idea, stay home because you're going to protect others by staying home. I think we do have to pause and reflect how quickly that was accepted by people and acted on by people, with only a tiny minority not taking that seriously. Now, having got people to there, you then have to curate that trust in an extremely careful way. And sadly, I don't think that's happened in this country.
Well, on that note, perhaps a little melancholy, but also inspiring about the power of stories, I think we should wrap up our discussion. With the best events, one's left with far more questions than one could possibly have answered. But really, I should like to extend my thanks to our two excellent speakers, to Ngaire and to Peter, for their wonderful, rich and thought-provoking answers and conversation. We all look forward to what life after COVID might be, and I think we have some skills and some answers to draw on there. So thank you both for your time and your expertise. Thank you too to the audience for joining us this evening. Apologies if we didn't get around to your questions, but I hope we've left you with some food for thought. Please join us next week on Thursday, the 25th of June at 5 p.m, when we'll be collaborating with the English faculty here at Oxford to host the live Professor of Poetry lecture with Alice Oswald. Alice Oswald is the current Professor of Poetry in the Faculty of English, and in this lecture titled Interview with Water, she'll be looking at the strange connection between water and grief. So we hope that you might be able to join us again there. And then, in the meantime, thank you for watching and goodbye.